thank you so much for coming. I'm so excited to be speaking to you tonight.
Thank them. I would have happily come anyway.
So tonight we're going to cover sort of like 4 of your key works in games, but then we're going to be probably going on sidetracks as well. So I think if we could start with the clip from Journey, because that's the first one we're going to talk about, that'd be great.
Great.
D'accord, David?
Okay. Boban, we are connected? Yes. Okay, we are connected, we can go. Austin Wintory, The Journey, Session 1.
So Journey, for many people, is like your big breakthrough game.
Actually, in fact, just to jump right on that, I'm pretty sure that most people in the world thought I was a kind of mid-40s bald guy, which in that case is the delightful conductor Oleg Kontradenko in Macedonia. But because that video went out and it says music by Austin Wintory and there's all these conducting credits and things, and then this comes out, I started getting a lot of messages from people like, oh, I saw you in this Journey video and it's so exciting. And I was like, we didn't calculate in advance the identity theft of a video like this. So it's always funny when I look at that, I have that random flashback. But yes, this for sure changed everything.
And because you'd already worked with that game company before, you'd already created the music for Flow. So this was the second time you'd worked with them, and obviously this was much bigger. So how did that change? Did that change the working relationship with them? How did you work with the team?
I mean, they're unique because they're like this enclave of artists. And so even though the scope of Journey was substantially beyond Flow, it's still a very kind of artist commune style working environment. And there's a lot of lateral kind of crosstalk. So for example, for me, the biggest inspiration on the project was Matt Nava, the art director, who also had art directed Flower and then started his own studio after Journey called Giant Squid, and we did Abzu together. Yeah. And so after Journey came out, Matt and I were kind of running around in the press where people would say, what was your biggest inspiration for the music? And I would say, oh, Matt's art. But then I'd read an interview with him where they'd say, what's the biggest inspiration for the art? And I'd say, oh, Austin's music. Because we were sharing a lot of works in progress with each other, where it just kind of organically it seemed to help.
Did you spend a lot of time actually in the studio?
Huge amount. I mean, almost, a lot of the people I work with are not in Los Angeles, but by good luck, TGC is. So it was 3 years on the game, and basically weekly stand-up meetings. I would drive down and just sometimes absorb what was going on. I had absolutely nothing new to contribute, or I had no impending deadlines of my own milestones. But I just wanted to kind of take in the vibe, you know, and the environment, and they're very artsy, as you might expect. So they would do, you know, a team lunch where someone would just come with the slides of like their trip they had just taken and show the rest of the team, and or someone would come with a book of poetry and read, you know. But the idea was, I want to share with all the rest of you things that kind of inform who I am. And, you know, next week it'll be that person and that person, that kind of thing. And so...
Did you do one?
I don't think so. Now that you ask, yes, I think actually they hate me now that you're making me... I was never quite welcome. They kept changing the locks, and I got around it. No, it was mainly just about absorbing. You know, it was one of those. I was the only member of the team, really, other than the Sony crew who were helping us, of course, like our sound designer Steve Johnson, our music production team, that kind of thing, and the producers. But I was the only kind of core developer team member that was not a staff, that game company person. I was kind of the token freelancer. So I was invited in, but always very much as a guest instead of I was kind of the honorary team member of that game company. But
were you only on that project when you were developing Journey? Was that the only project you were focused on at that time, or did you have lots of other projects that were on the go?
Yeah, I did. I had a lot of other concurrent films, you know, that would come and go in a 6-week span.
Yeah.
That kind of thing, typical sort of film schedules. But because Journey ran for 3 years, it was impossible. I mean, I couldn't possibly have survived on only that one job.
Yeah.
But also creatively, you know, I like if the schedule will allow it, and I can logistically handle multiple projects. But with games, that's not uncommon, because it's very often such a protracted schedule that I'm able to, or elongated schedule, I should say, I'm able to, you know, take a week off, focus on a film, and there'll be, you know, a 2-week period where I'm doing both, where it's kind of like I alternate every other day, or it's like before lunch is the game and after lunch is the film, or whatever. And I find that invigorating creatively, because it lets me kind of refresh my perspective by shifting gears into something wildly different. And actually, I worked on another game called Monaco, which is a wonderful kind of small indie game that I got hired for before Journey shipped. And so there was a period of time where I was working on both of those, and that couldn't have been more opposite of each other. Monaco's all crazy vaudeville solo piano, and Journey's obviously that. About 10,000 degrees removed from that aesthetic, I hope.
So how did you implement the music in Journey? Did you actually implement it yourself? Were you working with a programmer? Did you use Fmod?
So we were Sony had invested in their own proprietary music engine called Scream. Yes, which they have happily said, okay, to hell with that. That was not a good idea. I'm pretty sure everything is in WWise now. Over there. So everything I've done certainly with them since then has been. But at the time we were using Scream, so we were completely reliant on their in-house kind of audio guru, the audio everything guy, Monty Mudd, unbelievable asset to Journey. That guy, he was, you know, very musical, very understanding, but also very deep in the scripting. And he and I would sit for hours and hours and hours together. And I was hooked up onto their nightly build playtest server. So every morning I would make my cup of coffee, not unlike this one, and play that night's build, which would usually have yesterday's mock-ups baked in. I would send the mock-ups, and I had a giant Excel document of my instructions on how every single cue should be implemented and all the different triggers and layers and stems and all that kind of thing. Monty would put it in there as a mock-up, and I would be able the next morning to sip my coffee and play the game, which was awesome. And by the time the game shipped, I realized I've played Journey more than anyone alive. And I think for years and years, that record surely had to be true, because I must have logged 10,000 hours in the game. I mean, played every day for 3 years. And just making sure every single cue was just right.
I have to say, I think that probably does show, actually, because although it's a great soundtrack that you can actually just listen to, as you would any CD soundtrack, but I really think...
CD
soundtrack.
Heard of those.
Old school. But I do think when you actually play the game, it elevates the music. It's like all the different, the art, the gameplay, everything's working together. So it lifts the music and it lifts the art.
I was really lucky. I mean, there's so many moments in the game where they would say, you know, they would have a very skeletal kind of pencil sketch of the design, but it didn't exist even as a prototype yet. And they would say, here's the emotion we're after. I mean, a perfect example was there's a big sequence 2/3 of the way through the game where you're given this kind of overview of everything that's happened. It's one of the only sort of actual cutscenes in the game where it's just this playback of this big panorama that surrounds the player, and it's this huge moment musically. But it was one of those where they just said, we want kind of a big emotional thing. We don't really know what it is. So I wrote this piece. On the album, we call it The Final Confluence. At the time, it was called like 6M5-347 version 2 or whatever, but very sentimental title like that. And they heard it before there was any prototype of the scene or anything like that, and they all kind of stopped and went, well, goddamn, this is so much more emotional than we were planning. And I thought, sure, the next sentence would be, so can you reel it back in? But Genova said, no, we need to make the scene match this. This actually gives us a target. Before, we were aiming way lower than. I mean, he said it in a very flattering way. He said something like, we need to design this scene to do justice to this music, or something, which was really, still to this day, those kinds of comments are pretty surreal to me. But there's a lot of moments like that where I would do something with the score and they would hear it and say, ooh, this gives us a new idea on how to design this. And so they would start changing the design, but then I'd play that prototype and I'd say, oh, you know, that initial piece of music I don't think reflects where you've gone in the build. Let me give you another pass. So I would go write a whole new cue or a next version or something. And they'd hear that and say, you know, this is actually quite interesting. This gives us a new idea of something we can do with this and then. And then I'd play it and say, oh, you know, I think that music is shit now compared to what you've got here. I really should catch up to what. And so we were kind of doing this leapfrogging until Sony intervened as the adults in the room and said, this game has to come out eventually. And so they took it away from us. Otherwise, I'm pretty sure we'd still be iterating on it right now.
So how many iterations did you do on a queue, average, would you say?
It ranges wildly from like that sequence I was talking about where the camera's going around in a circle. That was essentially version 1. I did a tweak later to adjust for a timing change that they made. And then there's other cues that I wrote probably north of 20 versions, but most of which were self-directed, most of which was me saying, it's just not right, it's just not right. And then the whole finale, I can segue us if you like. The finale of the game, which is what you're primarily hearing in that video, went through a lot of iterations because, including on the gameplay side, we almost cut the whole thing. I mean, spoiler, you've had 6 years. The character kind of dies on the slopes of this snowy mountain. And everything was feeling really good about the game and really locking into place up until that moment. And then what happened after was just a total train wreck, and it was awful. And we couldn't figure out what was wrong with it. And we didn't really know that that was the point where things were going wrong. It's like we would talk to a playtester when they finished the whole game, and they'd be like, yeah, it was okay. But then we were like, but we know there's more here than just that, but we're losing them at some point. So we're kind of building this momentum, and then it falls apart. And then the funniest thing happened. My old college roommate was visiting LA, and he said, what are you up to? And I said, tell you what, I got a meeting. Why don't you come with me, and I can show you. And so TGC had a little room where they said, you want to play test the game and just give us your thoughts. So this wasn't one of our official play tests where Sony has like scorecards and it's official, and they have the cameras watching the player and you're staring at their face and it's awkward and wonderful. And this was just a guy in a room, and he gets to the mountain, and player collapses and it flashes to white, and then the build crashes, and it just hung on this all white screen. And he sat there and he sat there and he sat there, and then he comes out of the room and he has this look on his face, and he's like, that was the most transcendent thing I've ever experienced in my life. And we were like, well, fuck. We said, you know, the game crashed. That's not how it's supposed to end. And he was like, oh, it should. And there was this moment where everyone realized maybe he's right. And then, but suddenly, we rebooted the build. He played the ending. He was like, oh, that's crap. Just stop the way it should. You got divine intervention on my play test, and don't ignore it. And it made us realize the end is super flawed and completely back to the drawing board. And same thing with the music. I had tried a variety of approaches, and none of them were quite working. And we were really running out of time at that point. And with something like 3 weeks left before we were locking everything down, I just came in on some Sunday and just kind of wrote a thing spontaneously. And that is essentially what's there. But it lived on the backs of a lot of dead, burned crap versions.
Do you ever get writer's block? And how do you deal with that?
Honestly, no. I don't really ever get writer's block, but I hate most of what I write. So I feel like that's the trade-off. In fact, I always say to folks, I tell people I don't actually consider myself to be a great composer because I know that 99% of what I write is garbage. But what I think I'm reasonably good at is curating the crap out and knowing like, okay, this huge pile can just shove off. And this one thing somehow by some miracle is okay. And so I think my ability to kind of see the difference is the only thing I can like claim to positively, I think, because writing music is never a problem. It's the right music that's the challenge, the correct notes, you know, the rhythms and harmonies and all those things that are really damn elusive. So yeah, writer's block though has never been, vomiting up music is not difficult.